Waking Up is Not Enough. Flourishing in the Human Space, a podcast by Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger. When you peek into the cosmic unity of existence and feel the love and inspiration of awakening, what happens next? Whether it's through meditation, spiritual practice, near-death experience, ingesting a mind-altering substance, or being born again, you don't get a map for improving your messy life. In this podcast, Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger draw on expertise in science, psychology, adult development, psychedelics, NDEs, dreams, and Buddhist practice in conversations about compassion, resilience, responsibility, kindness, and development after awakening. You will learn how to chart a new path for flourishing in the human space, in which waking up is important, but not enough, and growing up is never finished. Co-hosts Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger bring different kinds of expertise. Polly is an author, psychologist, Jungian analyst, longtime Zen practitioner, couple therapist, and founder of Dialogue Therapy and Real Dialogue. Michael Berger is an entrepreneur, an expert in psychedelics, a spiritual practitioner of Jewishness, a skeptic, a Real Dialogue specialist, and a filmmaker who is known for his documentary, Improbable Collapse, The Demolition of Our Republic. Polly and Mike will engage with each other and invite a wide array of guests who are accomplished scientists and seekers whose work lies beyond the hegemony of materialism. In this episode of Waking Up, Flourishing in the Human Space, Polly and Mike speak with the renowned guest Ken Wilber on the complexities of meaningful communication in contemporary society. The dialogue delves into various themes, including stage theory, developmental psychology, the challenges of navigating woke culture, the resurgence of psychedelic experiences, and the pursuit of personal and spiritual growth.
But just recently reading Manifesting Zen, I've read it 3 times, I realized that he is also envisioning this same arc of development. It's the arc of development of the entire space-time. It's all of samsara is going through this same kind of integration that truly is represented in these stage theories and also in physics. I mean, in sciences, it's the same series of logics that are developing in the same arc. And it's pretty amazing to see the level of particularity and precision in the descriptions, whether they're from Zen, from stage theory, or now from physics, in some cases going beyond space-time and the idea that consciousness is generating space-time. There's something that's very remarkable that I would say I feel very grateful in my little itty-bitty lifetime here. I've been able to see this arc that seems to me to be where everything is going.
And that's what I call the spectrum of consciousness.
Yes.
And all things go through that major spectrum. And I agree with that. But I also recognize, like, the difference between a first-person experience and a third-person experience. Those are real. And that's why we actually have 3 completely different perspectival pronouns: first person, second person, and third person.
Right.
And those are all importantly different, going through the same generic, broad movement forward that all use the same generalized set of logics and go through the same generalized bands of the spectrum. There are important differences as well. So I think we're both talking essentially the same thing.
I want to get in one question about psychedelics, if I can. We seem to be going through a psychedelic renaissance. I was in Denver in June for
Which I'm very glad about, by the way, even though I'm not a psychedelic person myself. But I was most upset when they made them illegal in the late 60s, because I had at least read so many of the great authors that were writing about the psychedelic experience. I mean, Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts, they all wrote fantastic books on the psychedelic experience. And I tried psilocybin a few times. I tried acid one or two times. And I never had any particularly profound experience, although I did have a slight satori on that one psilocybin. But I just didn't like what it made me feel like in general. But I was really upset when they outlawed them, because I was aware that for many people, at least, it was a genuine doorway into a true mystical experience. And even when Harvard discovered them and it started giving all its theological students doses of acid, and like 70% of them reported the first ever mystical experience they'd had in their life, and these are theological students, I was going, way to go. This is going to be important contribution to society. And then the next thing I knew, the authorities went, oh, that's enough of that, and outlawed the whole lot of them. And I was just infuriated, because that stopped our research. Yeah, let's keep testing theology students. Let's test normal students. I mean, let's trust.
I don't know if you're familiar, but the head of MAPS, Rick Doblin, did a 50-year follow-up to the Good Friday experiment. And 50 years later, the majority of participants said it was the most significant, or other than the birth of a child, most significant experience. One question I have, which you've just touched on, is how important it is to integrate these experiences into one's daily life to have any kind of genuine personal growth from them. They're just tools, or possible tools. Can you share any insights, the most effective ways that individuals can incorporate the profound experiences into an ongoing spiritual practice and life journey to ensure that their insights aren't just fleeting moments, but catalysts for lasting transformation?
Sure. The most important thing is to try to identify what the actually most important core insight or experience was that you had, and try to describe it. So maybe it was a full-blown, I was one with everything. I mean, I'm not looking at this room, I am this room. And once you've identified what that core experience was, then repeat it as a thought. So you're bringing it into your daily experience. So I'm sitting here staring at this wall. Well, no, actually, I'm one with this wall. And by the way, this is completely off the mark, so forgive me, but there's a really clever experiment that was invented by Douglas Harding. And he wrote a book, he's from the Buddhist London Society. He wrote a book called On Having No Head. And it's true. I mean, it's a very effective way to slip into a non-dual unity experience. And he starts by saying, notice that of all body parts, the one that you cannot see is your own head.
Right.
So you can see your arms, your legs, but you can't see your head. You can get a mirror, but then you're not looking at your head, you're looking at the image out here. He says, and the reason is that you don't have a head. And what you think, where you think your head is, if you actually look and you try to feel your head, what you'll feel is everything you're looking at. So I'm looking at this wall. No, actually, this wall is sitting right on my head, right where I thought my head used to be. And I am that wall. That's right. Oh, and I'm that tree, and I'm that sky. It's all sitting right where I thought my head was. By using that as a way to remind me that I'm one with everything, and you just incorporate little almost gimmicks like that. And particularly if you've had an experience of like overwhelming compassion, then you just notice, oh, I have this extraordinary compassion for people. And just repeat that as a thought. Oh, I have extraordinary compassion, until you feel it, that compassion. And then do that on a day-to-day basis. And it really will become a habit. And if you work it into your personality in that specific way. And then if you want to work this unity in by having no head, go ahead and do that. That's always available. But it's finding the actual core of your psilocybin experience or your awakening experience or your satori, whatever it is, and identify what that core feeling or thought or emotion is, and then just keep repeating what that core is. That's a very effective way to work it into your actual being and awareness.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
And that brings in the issues, some of the issues that you were talking about in terms of speaking for oneself, using we, using you. These kinds of activities, require language, the speaking part. And the other kinds of insights that we have that go beyond language, whether they're mental images or whether they're simply the experiences of being one with something, they don't get rehearsed into language sometimes. And I think, again, the experiences that people have when they're in deep prayer, or the experiences that they can have in a born again situation, if they were able to integrate those experiences within a framework that would be more ordinary. I mean, ordinary for me means the walking around reality that we have. The reality is teaching us. I mean, it's not separate from us. And a lot we are taught through obstacles, through things that we don't agree with or that
Right.
give us pain and suffering. And in a sense, Jesus is the great teacher of that. I've just been reading a book on the yoga of Christ by Ravi Ravindra, and I'm very impressed by the book because it looks at the Gospel of St. John and it looks at Jesus in terms of his teaching through the crucifixion. And so I think that
And John emphasizes of all the Gospels, he emphasizes the mystical. It's
Yes.
only in John that Christ identifies himself with God.
Yes,
I am
yes.
the Father.
Yep.
Before Abraham was, I am. Those are all very profound
Very
unity.
profound. Yes, yes. And so, it's like if people can integrate their awakenings through using words that bring them into ordinary reality, the ordinary reality can teach them. But if they kind of, and this is the other thing about wokeness also, to go on about that, but if you keep it, if you sort of keep things to yourself, if you say, well, that's my private awakening, or I don't want to talk about that, it becomes egotistical. And very quickly, particularly awakenings, can seem like, because I see these people in therapy, I've seen people that have had some pretty profound awakenings, whether they're on psychedelics or even in Zen, that have led to greater narcissism.
Yeah.
It's like there's this sense of like, I'm special, or I have had this, and I think, wow, what a waste that you should separate yourself out with your awakening. And you've, I don't know, to me, this needs to be taught much more thoroughly, especially with the psychedelics, because there you can have people having these waking up experiences who really don't have much emotional maturity, and it goes towards narcissism really easily. So, I just wanted to introduce
that.
that.
Especially happens with the regressive movement that you see in wokeism, because virtually every developmental psychologist has at some point written a sentence like, increasing development is decreasing egocentrism.
Yes, exactly.
Each stage is a lessening of an egocentric focus.
Right.
And so you get less and less egocentric the higher you evolve.
That's right.
If you progress, you're regressing to more egocentric states and stages. And this is automatically a problem because confusing small self and big self is an occupational hazard of Zen Buddhism and every mystical tradition the world over.
Yes.
Because crazily enough, almost all mystical philosophies recognize that there's a small self and what is often just called a big self. And they're night and day. The small self is egocentric and it's dualistic and it's very, very self-focused and it's a very, essentially an undeveloped sense of self. And then as you develop and get more and more less and less egocentric, you're getting closer and closer to what's called big self. And big self is another word for God or Godhead. When Christ says I and the Father are one, he means I'm one with my own true self.
Right.
And so Zen will call it big mind and small mind, like Suzuki Roshi used to. But they have certain similar-ish traits. Because in egocentric, of course, you're very much identified with your separate self. So that's a very egocentric stance. But with big self is sometimes, well, Ramana Maharshi called the big self the I-I. The I. It's the I that is aware of your I. When you look within right now and look at your small self, it's your big witness self that's doing the looking.
Right.
And so there is a sense in which it is truly called big self, but it's a big self that's not egocentric. It's not focused on how wonderful it is, although in a certain objective sense, it is a very special self. It's God. I mean, it's I amness. And before Abraham was, I am, because this big self is timeless. It's spaceless. There's no space between you and the wall. You are one with the wall. And so if you're not careful, it's fairly easy to confuse big self with small self, simply because in some sense they are both a self sense. The witness is aware of itself as a witness, as a big self. It's what is aware of all of the objects in its focus. It's what's aware of your small self. And before Abraham was, I am. So that's a somewhat special stance, but it's not special in the sense of egocentric or look at me or self-glorifying or any of those. Those are all egocentric holdovers or confusions. But
and many of the woke ideologies focus on identity, which is definitely the egocentric, because when people say this is you have to use my pronoun, this is my identity. Why is there so much focus on identity? That's kind of a mistake to begin with. It's like focusing on identity is even like a narrative about your ego, which is starts to be a dictate about how you will appear to others. And it's so misleading. It's a painful, misleading turn to take, and I know again that it's not intended to be that, and yet it results in that. And again, getting back to our earlier part of our conversation, if our most elite universities are teaching that this is the way to freedom, is to identify with something and then fight for your identity and make sure your group gets justice and make sure the opposite group gets whatever, thrown out or something, then there's this reinforcement of egocentrism, as well as obviously conformity and this mythic thinking, but also simply the egocentrism is very painful. It's very painful to walk around feeling like you have to defend your identity all the time. And that's...
I think there is actually, I wrote a book called The Atman Project. And the Atman Project was one of my first fully developmental models. And it traced the growth stages in a circle from birth, which is in the Christian mystical great chain of being, goes from matter to body to mind to soul to spirit. And at birth, the infant can't distinguish his physical self from the physical environment.
Right.
So it's one. There's a
it's non-dual. It's a non-dual.
And that a-dualism is not to be confused with non-dualism.
Right.
And every romantic thinker in the world starts with that confusion.
Yes.
One with its world. It's in Eden. It's living this life of a wholeness and oneness. No, it's not. It's just its physical body can't be distinguished from the physical world. The mind, the symbols that the mind used are not yet differentiated from the things it presents. Right. And because of that, you have next to the archaic stage is the magic stage, because magic, often called word magic, because the infant thinks that to alter the word, because it's not different from the thing, it's to actually alter the thing.
Right.
It has people thinking all the time, particularly as it grows and itself evolves. My point was that the reason I called things the Atman project is that we always have an intuition of our infinite true self.
Mm-hmm.
Intuition is given to all sentience because the true self is ever present. You
Mm-hmm.
always this true self, no matter what stage of small self ego development you're at. But because we are always intuiting this infinite Atman, we often confuse that intuition of an infinite Atman with some finite thing. And so all of our desires for finite things in the world are really searching for that infinite Atman. And so we're in some form of Atman project, including stages of growth that we go through. And so I think the fact that everybody can intuit their real self, their real Atman, that even some of these woke people occasionally, I mean, they introspect, their ego identity is so important to them. They're always looking within, even if it's just at their ego. But the thing that's doing the looking is the witness, is to some degree occasionally intuit that real self and immediately apply it to their ego self.
You know, that the infant, yes, the infant is not separated out from the environment and it's all one. And yes, it's true. It's much more like the dog. It's not like, you know, this is the breakthrough of real non-dualism.
Right.
But that capacity is there in all of us from the beginning to have that unitary experience and not to separate out. When we do separate out, you're correct. I am sure. I agree completely that sometimes it's the motivation to find that oneness, and then you overdo the ego identity. But at the same time, there are these serious fundamental mistakes that humans make that lead to war, you know, repeatedly. And only humans do this. The dog is not doing it. The tree is not doing it. The cockroach isn't doing it, which is to objectify the world, and then we objectify others in our species, and then we kill or destroy, like to destroy what's, you know, taken so long to create. Every human being is given birth by somebody who sacrificed to give birth over a long period of time. They sacrificed that. I've sacrificed it a couple of times, actually 3 times when I had an ectopic pregnancy the first time. So, you know, it's a big sacrifice to give birth. Then it's a tremendous amount of resources to raise a human being, all sorts of beings. So you destroy all of
extraordinary long time,
extraordinary long time, all sorts of resources, and then destroying that being, you know, in a moment with a drone, a bomb, you know, whatever. This is really, really grotesque to do that.
And it's the essence of egocentrism.
It's the essence of it, and it's not necessary. So, you know, that sense of egocentrism, and particularly pulling into, I am different from you. You are this kind of thing that is not and does not deserve what I deserve. This creates.
You are subhuman.
Yeah, subhuman, you know, not like me. And the implications and the consequences of that kind of move, I get afraid, are also buried again in this kind of, you know, identity politics, wokeness type of thing that is using education, resources, all sorts of wonderful things to produce results that are truly disabling. They're not good. They're not good results. They're really false. And then you can add the psychedelics to all of this, and it doesn't necessarily get better. You know, I mean, I want to come back to the Renaissance, the psychedelic Renaissance. And Mike, how do you see the psychedelic Renaissance, you know, coming into this this world that we're in, where there's this fragmentation? There is also, you know, a lot of emphasis on the ego among educated people.
Well, I think adding from this conversation and from what Ken shared is adding the stage development theory to the awareness of the people taking psychedelics. And with the recent publication by Gould Dolan in Nature in May last year about how different psychedelics open up the critical window. I think the implications of the importance of integration and having a much bigger window to fit it in, a perspective and understanding the conflation, I think, it's related to what I think you called the pre-trans fallacy. And so understanding where you are in your stage would be incredibly helpful input in terms of integrating this experience so that it actually helps you to move into a less egocentric stage, as opposed to having it blow up your ego and thinking you are all that is.
Right. And that, by the way, is the only approach that I have found works when I'm trying to talk somebody out of their wokeness, is saying, let's look at the stages that we all go through. These aren't linear, and we have many different types of intelligence, and we can be at a different stage at any of them. So you're going through a very multiplistic, pluralistic experience. But I want to just point out certain basic levels or bands in the spectrum of consciousness that you have. And when they sort of start to get that there really is a magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral stages of development. And then when I ask them, okay, where do you think you are? And it slowly, their eyes get huge and they're bug out of their head. And they're like, oh, well, when I'm woke, I'm very magical. That's not really high, is it? Not really.
No.
And the claws in the tooth theory, right? Then stop applying it to the rest of your life. Because guess what? There is no Santa Claus, there is no tooth fairy, and there is no real woke state. You're not in a real state when you're being woke. You're in a very egocentric state, which is one of the lowest stages of development you can get in. And by the way, in even a very egocentric state, I maintain that every ego can intuit Atman, because Atman is present ultimate reality, and they can intuit it. But what they tend to do, since they've already confused their big self with their small self, is they'll apply a lot of the power and the strength of Atman to their ego, and with that, they will gladly kill other people. And that's why wars necessarily get so ugly, is they're doing it through an egocentric perspective with the force of God, the force of Atman. And how else can you explain a person gladly going in and shooting another person to death right in front of them? That's an enormous power. That's an enormous strength that makes you think you have the right to do that. And the Atman project, and all wars of Atman projects.
That, from an Atman perspective, and I wanted to really hear how you see that shift from in India, from the Atman to the Anatman. But from that perspective, the repercussions of killing another human being karmically are so tremendously severe that they last for lifetimes. And again, if people understood that, if they could see the implications, because, and I've said recently when I've been asked to say it, that killing and dying from being killed are very different from dying from a natural cause. And the whole aspect of dying itself is a spiritual experience, but killing is not, and being killed is not. And that karma, that the people that are doing the killing to kill humans with, so many implications, what is being destroyed is really so grave. And now it seems as though there are many people who are educated and who are, otherwise, it seems like thoughtful people that don't recognize the graveness of doing these things. I do think that we've moved so far away from religions, we don't any longer take that as a truth. And so instead we are into things like governments and politics as our truth, which is really it so fails people, and so that sense of the graveness of killing, yes, it is done in the moment of identifying with the Atman, I imagine it is done then. But then there are so many implications that are.
Yeah, all you have to do is read the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Yeah.
If I admire Tibet as a group of people enormously. Because I've always said, look, if there's a spiritual problem anywhere in the world, the Tibetans have figured out how to handle it. And they're on top of everything, including who but the Tibetans would dare describe the three nature states as after death that you go through on the way to being reborn.
Right.
And all you have to do is read the Tibetan Book of the Dead to see what an extraordinarily glorious experience death is. I mean, according to the Tibetan book, as soon as you die, you and everybody who dies naturally are instantly enlightened. They're immersed in the absolute unity consciousness that's infinite and eternal and radiant and pure light and all of that. And so what they typically do with the dead is have people read reminding statements, often called pith statements, of the fact that, okay, you are now one with ultimate reality. Recognize that oneness and be with that. Because what happens a certain amount of time later, can be from 7 days to a month, is that you move out of that oneness or causal purity into a subtle or dream-like or archetypal type stage. And there are all sorts of gods and goddesses come around, and you're attracted to the ones of a certain intensity of light, and you're not attracted to others. But what you don't want to do is move away from them, because then you can move into various hell realms. And that's an unpleasant part of your journey if you do that. But then when you finish going through that subtle stage, you move into the gross stage, which is the physical days of your rebirth. And then in that, you'll see a man and a woman making love. And if you're a boy, you'll step in between them to try to separate the father away from the mother so you can have the mother. And if you're a girl or female, you'll try to separate and get mom away from dad so you can have dad. But what you don't realize is the moment you start to try to separate them, you're instantly born with them as your parents.
Right.
And so you not only don't separate them, you're actually biologically hooked to them.
If you faint during the death process itself, you're missing that oneness thing. You know, there are many complexities in dying. And one of the most difficult complexities, by all accounts, is a life review. Like if your life review is so torturous that it takes you essentially into fear, anxiety, and pain, then you're going to miss that opportunity for oneness, and you're going to be thrust into that dreamlike realm where there's a lot of confusion. So, you know, in a natural dying process, under the best of circumstances, you glimpse that oneness, or perhaps you join it and you move through. But if you have harmed a lot of people in your life, your dying is not going to be the kind of thing you were describing. And again, I think if people could understand this continuity between the movement of consciousness from one kind of embodiment into another embodiment, there's continuity there, and you can prepare for it. You can think about it. You can talk with, particularly, you learn a lot from Tibetans, like you said. You know, the Tibetans are really, really good at mapping this. When people say, oh, nobody knows what happens after we die. Well, of course, that's wrong. That is wrong. There are a lot of people that know a lot, and you should get interested in it. And then there are people at the University of Virginia that are studying it too.
Sure. The near-death experience, there's been a lot of scientific research on that. And what's so striking about it is the similarity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Goes through. Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's true. Yeah. This is truth. This is what truth is. And so, you know, the thing, though, that this being bound up with one's ego and then creating harm, and particularly creating war, is so grievous and so unnecessary. There's now not only knowledge, but there are all sorts of practices and ways of being to avoid this. We do not have to do this anymore. We're not running around with sticks and stones and rocks and so on.
Yeah, and the unnecessary part is what makes it so grievous.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
It's horrifying.
Absolutely.
that you don't have to be doing this. But look, you're shooting every person you can see.
Yeah, I know.
You have
I
to
know.
be doing that.
It's really particularly, I think, at this moment in time when I would say there is a way in which we're on the verge of having a deeper understanding of consciousness,
Yeah.
and of its development and the stages and death and the movement of consciousness from
And
lifetime
it's
to lifetime.
misplacements, it's Atman projects,
Yes, right.
all of it.
All of these things, and at this very moment that we should get thrown into these other things, really,
Yeah.
like really, and especially intelligent people, is this really what we're going to do? I guess we are. I mean, when Claudine Gay quit, I thought, whoa, this is just not a good thing, because she should have stayed and learned and articulated, and
Right.
and the first African-American president, I guess the second woman president of Harvard. I only read this, I don't know this for a fact, but this is a big opportunity that she could have stayed with.
Yeah.
And the fact that she didn't said to me that the forces are difficult. They're difficult.
Yeah.
But they're not impossible.
And so is the egocentricity that remains in
Yes.
all of us to some degree, because she really took an egocentric way out.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Like, oh, look, I'm out of here. I'm not even going to put up with it. I don't have to put up with this. I'm better than this. I'll see you all around.
Right.
Suffer with my loss. Y'all will suffer. Bye-bye.
Right. And then she also said, look, there are those people who are after Harvard and they're after the elite universities. Really? I mean, couldn't we just have a conversation about this? But, ultimately, there's a kind of irony that I feel that this is an irony, that the three of us in our conversation, we could sound like libertarians here.
Yeah.
We're sounding like, we're going to go out and defend freedom. I never would have thought that would be the position I'm in. I thought this was a kind of a progressive position, and suddenly it's a libertarian position, and people are suspicious. Some of my friends, my progressive friends, that I would defend free speech. Well, you need it in order to grow and develop. You need it to have these conversations. You can't do this thing without speech. You can't do waking up, like you said, without bringing it back into speech and rehearsing even what your insights were, and then talking to other people. And then you gradually see that, in fact, the mind of God is very close by, but it's always kind. It's always kind. It's never going to say, kill that person. That's not the mind of God. You could test that out really simply. And so,
it's not going to say that according to the New Testament. In the Old Testament, it's a little bit iffier.
Well, there was a lot of egocentrism and mythic thinking in the Old Testament. I mean,
those are
those are definitely the mythic thinkers. And, there are things I disagree with Jung about, but I do like some of his work very, very much. In his answer to Carl Jung. Yeah, I'm a Jungian analyst by training, but, in the answer to Job, he said that the reason that God wanted to take human form was in order to develop the awareness of his awareness. He wanted to develop human awareness because he lacked it. He was too mythic. I mean, he didn't have the awareness. And so he couldn't be aware of his own awareness. And so he decided, essentially, I've got to become human to learn that. And so that is really what we do. We have an advantage with that. It's even over the Old Testament. We can become aware of what we're doing, and we can stop doing things. And but that's not been happening recently on some fronts.
And it is a great shame. And the only thing about God becoming one man is that you see a little bit of a mythic holdover there.
Yeah.
And that it's the big self becoming one small self, where actually the big self produces every small self.
Right.
And the mystics stumble into this reality, and they're always saying, all men are Jesus.
Yeah.
Everybody, not I, but Christ lives in me. Everybody can say that. And that's a little bit more rational and less mythic.
I mean, you kind of wonder about the language of Jesus sometimes, like, but I mean, I think, well, who knows? No one really does know how all that language got translated from here to there either. It's like the Buddha was, written down in 454 years after he died. Well,
Right.
maybe, I can't remember what happened yesterday. So, I don't think I would be doing a good job of
Right.
454 years
And
ago.
all
But
sutras start with the phrase, thus I have heard.
thus I have heard, right?
And it's supposedly Ananda, a Buddha's cousin,
Right.
who has heard and is writing down what he's heard. But every sutra starts that way.
Right.
And it's very unlikely the same person heard. But that's what happens when they realize the universal self, the oneness. They all truly feel that they're that big self. And that big self was present when Buddha was present.
Yeah.
Because it was his self as well as yours.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So Mike, bring psychedelics back in here
Yeah.
before we say goodbye. Do you have something that you want to bring in here?
Well, actually, I was thinking about, just from the conversation, the issue is about, well, one way of looking at it, I'm thinking about the inability to hear because of the stage I'm at. One of the experiences I've noticed is, in trying to even just lay out or discuss stage theory, is people at certain stages hear it as a threat to their ego. And so there isn't even the possibility, or I've not found let me say, an easy way to actually have the conversation. And so revolving, I guess, in a way through all of this is, I keep hearing, well, we need to express this in words. We need to speak to each other. We need to speak to each other and try to reflect on maybe this space between the small self and the big self. And yet the challenge in language is, I'm only going to hear it depending on where I'm viewing it from.
Yep.
And
That's
so,
right.
From the psychedelic perspective, I see aspects of people mistaking the experience where their small self is mistaken for the big self, and then they think they have something or are something, and now they are to lead. And it just seems we're at a place now where it's really challenging for people to slow down enough just to hear each other, that it's as if we're losing the ability to listen in a more respectful, open way.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the woke movement isn't helping that, because it, of course, intentionally shuts down hearing.
Right.
And that's what's so unbelievable about it as a movement.
Yes, and the notion which you mentioned earlier, that you're going to a university where you are supposed to really push the envelope on what you think in openness, and you're having people shut down anybody who has an opinion that they don't want to hear, that they don't even have the potential to hear something or tolerate difference. And again, this is directly related to stage theory.
Yeah.
So I was wondering,
and that's why I continue to see some version of developmental psychology becoming part of a top common discussion that we have. Because first of all, I think it's possible, because some developmental writers are very interesting. They're very clear. They're extremely intelligent. Jane Lovinger is a good idea. Robert Keegan has had a fair amount of success with getting his books out, and he talks his basic 5-stage spectrum. But it's the only thing that digs into the woke paradigm of thinking, because it actually points out the different levels of thinking that you can be at. And when people first hear that, they'll often take it in a negative way. So you want to introduce it with particularly simplistic approaches. So I want to talk to you about what happens to us from the time we're born to the time we become an adult. And you might notice in that space that you're not the same as you were when you were 1 year old. When you were 1 year old, you couldn't even talk. Now all you do is talk. So what were there stages that we went through? Were there steps you have to do? Because all learning usually involves some sort of step by step learning process. And then it turns out that there are steps that we have gone through. And once people figured that out, once psychologists figured that out, they actually started studying those steps. And the incredible thing about it is that there are now dozens of models of these various steps, but they all come to very similar agreement on what these major steps are. And I want to talk to you about those. And then we'll talk about ways you can figure out what step you're at if you want to. And then we'll see what that means. And then, and more importantly, if you want to get to a higher step, what can you do?
By the way, Ken, I want to jump in there because that's actually how this podcast started. I was introduced to Polly when I found you and Polly having a discussion about waking up, growing up. And then I, after working with Polly for some time, asked her, so how do you grow up?
Yeah.
And I talked about stage theory.
Yeah.
And and the thing about stage theory that to me, that's really been so deeply remarkable, because I taught it for a long time and then I backed away from it just because it's so complex and people don't necessarily seek out that understanding. And, I'm a psychotherapist. And so most people that are in the psychotherapy business, they're not interested in stage theory. But what I've come back to it because the idea that adulthood is not one single thing, like becoming an adult. Oh, we're all adults here. We should be able to relate as adults. We're adults. And when I saw, first of all, when I saw this woke ideology developing, maybe it was even before that, when I began to realize that there wasn't an open conversation going on about a lot of things that were happening in our government, that were happening, on a larger perspective, that there were sort of manipulated conversations. Then the woke thing came out and so on. I began to see that it was important to come back to stage theory, because what I would say for me, the thing was propaganda. That propaganda appeals to conformists. Most of the population is at that stage, just a little beyond true conformity to the group. And they're so available to propaganda. And so there were all kinds of propaganda coming in. And one of those things eventually became this postmodernism and wokeism and so on. But that began to also eat up some of the conscientious sort of post-conformity. And I started to get scared then. I started to see, whoa, there's a reason now to really return in a serious way to this underlying logic. When I say logic, a lot of people say, well, what do you mean by logic? I simply mean that there's a map. It's a secure map. It's like the Tibetans did the map about dying.
It's a structure.
It's a structure. It's a map. It is universal. And there are developmental theorists who did a map that is universal, that's as good as the Tibetan map for dying. This is a map for adulthood. And there are predictable changes. And if you don't know that, you might get lost in the propaganda, And so I've been coming back to stage theory. And since then, I read Sasaki's book, Manifesting Zen, and I saw from his articulation much more clearly than I'd ever seen that the whole proposition is moving in one way. And, when you see that, it becomes ever more important to talk about, adulthood and how we change in adulthood. And there's no psychedelic, there's no Zen sitting, there's nothing that can substitute for that change, because it's an everyday integration of the subject and object that is moving along a certain continuum. And you can't, maybe you hasten it a little bit by taking some psychedelics, because you might be able to see into the nature of love in some way, but you can do it without the psychedelics also. I just began to see how important it is to talk about stage theory. But, you've introduced something today that I haven't even tried. I've never tried to sit down with somebody who's in one of these stages of development where they're arguing about, justice and equity and so on, and say, hey, wait a minute, we're all kind of caught here. I'd like to look with you at this map. Are you willing to look at it? Because people don't come to me to look at this map. They don't come for that reason. But just to offer it more like an offering, like this is out there and it will help you. And where do you think you are on this on these
Exactly.
stages.
And the way I always begin that particular discussion is with the example that I just used with y'all, which is think of where you were when you were 1 year old,
Right.
and look at where you are now, and just
Right.
think of some of the differences. You couldn't even talk, let alone understand language, and
Right.
then you learned language. How did that happen? Did that happen in all at once? Like one day you couldn't talk, and the next day you woke up, you're saying the Gettysburg Address. And no, you probably went through several steps or stages, right? Yeah. Well, are those stages, they have been actually studied. And scientists, once they figured out that there was a difference between a 1 year old and a 20-year-old, they started looking at the actual steps that you go through to get from age 1 to age 20. And again, the remarkable thing about all of their studies is the essentially similar number of stages and types of stages that we go through. And down the line, introduce generally waking up and growing up. But my point is just to get across the growing up stages.
Yeah.
If I do introduce waking up, I'll point out that even though they're all going through essentially the similar broad spectrum of consciousness, that there are certain lines of development that are slightly different. So we have a first person line, we have a second person line, we have a third person line. And those are real differences. There's a real difference between moral development, first person development. Moral development wants to deal with how you and I, as a we, get along and how we should treat each other. And even though that's an important part of our self growing up, that you can see that there's a difference, because when you're in the self growing up stage, you're in a first person. You're aware of that stage. You experience a first person waking up experience. And you know what it means. You know that it means you're one with the universe or whatever. But that's a very real, acknowledged, awakened, aware first person experience. But when you're going through these stages where you're learning speech, or you start to get fairly evolved and start learning mathematics, let's say, you go through certain stages in that growing up development, but you're not really aware of them in the same way you are with the waking up experience, because they're not first person immediate realizations. So if you're at, say, a conformist stage of development and you introspect, you won't see a big sign that says conformist stage.
Right.
It's just not a first person experience.
If you're in an analysis, you do start to see what your assumptions are, because you're investigating with another person.
Of course.
And that investigation does allow you to see some of it. But even with that, nobody is in an analysis going to give you a map of stage theory.
Right.
You don't know that there are other stages that are unfolding, and particularly in adulthood, because people say, well, it's random. After you get to be 25 or so, it's just random. The way you develop, there's no one thing that contributes. No, it's not random.
Yeah.
It's not random.
And they should also know that they're getting therapy, and the inventor of that therapy was obsessed with stages of development, whether it's Freud, Young, Atman, or Otto Rank. They all made profound developmental contributions.
Right, exactly. And as you pointed out, it is interesting to me always that, the Tibetan theory about rebirth does include the Oedipus complex. It was out there. Maybe Freud was a Tibetan in an earlier lifetime, and he just discovered that, in the
Leave it to
19th
the
century.
Tibetans to hit upon the Oedipus complex.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, I've heard Young Rinpoche teach both in India and the US. And when he teaches about how the entity that's coming back in through the mother and the father, how they feel about the mother and the father, he changes it in the US versus in India when he teaches there. It's a little different flavor because he knows the culture is a little different. Yeah, I think that the idea of stages of development, that was around for the early inventors of psychotherapy. But I think there are a lot of people who don't think it's scientific. They don't know that there's a scientific theory of adult development that's very predictive. and very
Yes.
predictable. And you can apply it to different cultures and so on.
And there's an enormous amount of evidence,
Evidence, yeah.
scientifically generated evidence.
That's
I mean,
right.
there are Kohlberg's stage model has been tested in over 40 different cultures,
Yeah,
and they have found no exceptions
That's
to
right.
his major stages.
That's right.
They have found, well, in India, they have a stage 4.5, but
Yeah.
it's really exactly between stage 4 and stage 5.
Yeah.
It's a real 4.5,
It's
but
just
that's it. I mean, and Lovinger, of course, has been tested in numerous cultures.
I said all over the world, and some of the, as Mike has pointed out to me, some of the German scientists that are using her work have added a stage. They've added a 10th stage called flow. That's interesting, but I don't know if it's absolutely necessary.
It gets very interesting because the higher you go in growing up, the more likely it is that you'll have some sort of waking up experience.
Yes.
It's not necessary, but it's more likely that you
Yeah.
can have a waking up experience. And then it shows up, if you're testing that person, that waking up unity or oneness or whatever the qualities of waking up are, they'll start to show up in their tests.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I've scored so many sentence completion tests. When you get above 4 or 5 in her language, that would be kind of beyond individualistic. The metaphors, the poetry, it's amazing.
Yep.
You know, you see things that sound like Zen koans. They're written on this sentence completion test. It's rare. It's not common. So it's very, very rare, but it's produced again and again if you get a large enough data set.
Right.
The other thing about adult development is if you have a room of 100 people, the likelihood is you got 3 stages. You don't have the
Right.
full range there. So again, it's not like most of the time you see everything from the pre-conformist impulsive stage to the most integrated, autonomous integrated. So you don't see that in any population typically.
Yeah,
So
that's what I call the center of gravity. And the center of gravity is general stage that you're most frequently operating from. But that also includes bits of the previous stage and bits of the successor stage. So that's the 3 stages that you commonly get in any crowd.
in any group. So we're just about to finish up here. It's been fantastic talking with you as always. And I'm sure we'll talk to you again. And I'm grateful to you, Ken, on so many levels for your work, your being. And I look forward to you continuing here on Earth with us for a while still. I hope you will.
Sure, certainly.
Yes.
It's been a delight talking with both of you.
I've really enjoyed the opportunity. I really have been following your work for 40 years. So it's really been a pleasure from beyond ego and beyond.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll be in touch again, I'm sure. We're trying to form a community of people that is in conversation about consciousness and its development. And we'd love to bring you into that community. I mean, you are in it already, but it's in a more obvious way. So thank you so much for the time and for today.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this conversation, please take a moment right now to go to realdialogue.com and join our membership community. For a short time, we're offering annual and lifetime membership in the Real Dialogue community at a very limited cost. There you have access to countless hours of teachings, interviews, conversations with Polly, Mike, and prominent scientists, sages, and seekers who share your interests in waking up and flourishing. Again, go to realdialogue.com, join in a live conversation with Polly and Mike through your membership. The second Tuesday of each month, we have an AMA that we do together. As always, we really look forward to meeting you and to hearing your perspective. Please like and share the podcast with friends and family. If you know of people who you think would benefit from this conversation and would like to take part in our monthly AMAs, consider sharing this with family and friends and consider giving them the gift of membership in our community. This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Coltrane and is part of the Center for Real Dialogue. It is available on all major podcast channels for free. Thank you for listening. And I also would like to just take a moment to announce the upcoming foundational training in Real Dialogue and Dialogue Therapy being held in Stowe, Vermont at the Trap Lodge. There are 3 4-day sessions in the next training. Session 2 will be February 1st through 4th, and Session 3 will be April 18th to the 21st of 2024. For more information, you can go to realdialogue.com, and from the menu select Foundational Training. All the details are there. If you have any questions about the training or anything in the podcast, you can email me at mike@realdialogue.com.